Okay, hello everyone. I am Michele Puggia. I will be the host for this interview. It is part of ITSS Verona member series on military strategy and intelligence. I am joined here today by Professor Joachim Koops. He is Chair of Security Studies and Scientific Director at the Institute of Security and Global Affairs at Leiden University's campus in The Hague, and he's an expert on global security governance. Professor, it is a pleasure to have you here today.
Nice to meet you again. Great to be on. Thanks to ITSS for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. So today we'll be trying to delve a little bit on the topic of international interventions in the field of security. We'll try to understand what have been the causes for the termination of the UN mission in Mali, and what will be the consequences of this termination for the broader security community. And then we'll try to speculate a little bit what will be the future for these kind of operations. So, Professor, I would like to start off with the first question right away. Which, in your opinion, have been the causes, the main causes for the termination of MINUSMA?
Yeah, no, thanks. And good to talk about that. I mean, there are other new conflicts now, obviously more in the news than Sahel and Mali, but I think it's very important to focus on it and keep on a strong focus on it because it has implications beyond the region and beyond UN peacekeeping. So what were the causes of withdrawal? I mean, maybe just quickly walking back, this was really a significant UN peace operation launched in 2014 because of a variety of issues, instability in the Sahel, essentially a hiding place for terrorism, and also lots of implications for civilians, terrible massacres, and so on. MINUSMA was also a really large multidimensional mission by the UN, and also one of the most dangerous ones. The fatality rate of a variety of UN soldiers was very, very high. Now, the problem really emerged, and we should also not forget that this was backed by the West quite a lot. France, in particular, was quite an architect of that mission. And in 2021, there was a military coup in Mali, and the transitional authority, as they called themselves, already shifted their attention away from France, from the West, from the UN, and towards Russia. So that's why it's an important implication beyond peacekeeping. It is the rivalry between Russia and the West played out in Africa and in the Sahel. The Wagner Group was active in Mali from that moment on, 2021. And in fact, the Malian authorities were looking for, let's call it what it was, for an excuse to get essentially rid of the UN presence and the presence of the West. Presence of the West because the UN mission was also accompanied by other supportive missions, such as the European Union. They had a training mission alongside the mission in Mali, and the French, of course, had a parallel mission to the UN. So it was not just about peacekeeping, but also about its global ramifications. Then 2022, an important moment where there was the so-called Mura massacre, where Malian forces and Wagner mercenaries killed a large scale of civilians. There was an investigation into that led by the UN and the UN human rights architecture. And there was quite a damning report on the Malian troops, carrying out massacres on civilian populations, and that led to further frictions between the UN and the host state nation. So by 2022, the transitional authority simply announced, quite unexpectedly to some, that they want to withdraw host state consent from the UN mission, and they want the UN mission out, and they want to fully collaborate with the Russians. Why does the UN have to leave? Because there are three major principles, as you know, on peacekeeping: neutrality, impartiality, limited use of force, and host state consent. So if the host state, the state hosting a peacekeeping mission, says we no longer want the peacekeepers on our soil, then normally the UN peacekeepers have to leave. The Secretary General Guterres tried a lot of compromise, a lot of diplomatic initiatives there to maybe adapt the mission, but the Malian authorities wanted the mission to wind down, and that's what's happening right now. There is a winding down, dissolution process of this very important mission, with a lot of ramifications for the Sahel and beyond.
For sure. Thank you for your answer, Professor. Now I wanted to understand with you a little bit, what do you think will be the main consequences after this closure, the closure of this mission, and also considering the well, the political instability in Western Africa that you mentioned, for the main security institutions like the EU, the UN, and NATO.
Yeah, I mean, we see now what many feared. I mean, Mali and Niger was a kind of important focus point and anchor for trying to advance some kind of stability, right? And the UN mission, MINUSMA, was an important platform for this, around which many other actors and organizations then latched on for a variety of stabilization efforts. Whether they were successful themselves or not is a different question. But I mean, at least you had something there. You had an anchor for a variety of humanitarian aid, for security efforts, for protecting civilians, and for trying to also prevent terrorist networks from taking too much hold. Now we know there's a kind of domino effect because Niger also fell to a military coup. That was the last kind of island of international focus and international stability activities, and so now there is really concern that that region, on the one hand, collapses in terms of stability, on the other hand, falls entirely into the sphere of influence of Russia. And that has, of course, also consequences for, civilians in that region, but also, of course, the rise of terrorist networks. And at the end of the day, also migration flows that for some countries, particularly in Europe, will also lead to political unrest again. If you know the entire migration, I don't have to explain that to you, of course, the entire migration politics nexus, where it is on the one hand a big challenge, on the other hand it's just fertile ground for far-right parties to exploit it, also for undermining European political stability. So we're in that kind of situation. The EU had to also make some hard decisions because they were faced with a situation where they either withdraw their own missions and support, meaning that they will leave even more the field open to other actors and KOs. On the other hand, they could not be seen to support a military junta in Mali that at the same time was collaborating with Russia and the Wagner Group. So you were kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. So the Europeans also are winding down their training missions and support missions in both Niger and MINUSMA. So in Mali. So the Sahel is really becoming yet another zone of instability with potentially far-reaching consequences, and again a hotspot of geopolitical rivalry between Russia, to a certain extent China, and the West.
Okay, thank you. And now, changing a little bit the focus of our questions, the NATO 2022 strategic concept warrants increased capacity building programs and also increased cooperation with its allies to address security concerns emerging in its southern neighborhood. Now, I wanted to ask you if you think that is a feasible prospect, considering the current focus, of course, on the war in Ukraine and the Eastern Front. Sorry, did you perceive my question? Did you understand?
Yeah, sorry, it was a bit choppy, but as I understand, it's about NATO's southern flank and capacity building, right?
Yeah. I wanted to understand if you believe that it is possible now for NATO to, well, do what it expects itself to do, considering the focus on Ukraine.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's good to know, just with a quick eye on history, that the concept of the southern flank already exists in NATO strategic documents and discourse since the 50s. It was essentially the Turkey-Greece flank. It was then, broadening the geopolitical implications of the Mediterranean and beyond, Gulf, Middle East, and so on. Throughout the decades, NATO has tried, and particularly since the end of the Cold War, to open up dialogues, programs, relationships with that region, going all the way also to the Gulf states. There is a kind of institutional relationship with the Gulf Cooperation Council, minus Saudi Arabia and Oman. They're kind of a little bit on the sidelines. There has been done quite a lot of work also to include MENA countries, Tunisia in particular, cooperation with Jordan, but also, and that's most controversial for some of those partners, Israel. So there's a close relationship also between NATO and Israel in terms of capacity building. Now, the most important recent cooperation initiatives that really are focusing on defense capacity building were in that region, in particular Iraq, Jordan, and then Tunisia. With those three countries, there's quite a close relationship in training, even cyber resilience, cyber defense, counter IEDs, so improvised explosive devices, and general defense capacity training. That still continues, but it's not really intensive. It's not like that it's a massive transfer of weapons or a massive transfer of concentration of personnel. I mean, this is mostly train the trainer initiatives. This is often regional dialogues. NATO has every year a kind of partnership forum also where they invite all these kind of partners. There's been a request by Libya to have some training on the maritime security and border guards. That's a bit more controversial for a variety of obvious reasons with human rights abuses. But that potters along, that carries on. That said, of course, the most important focus is Ukraine. The most important focus, by the way, part of that defense capability partnership is also a relationship with Moldova. And that's, of course, key, because there you see already a variety of tensions and high risks that another attack from Russia could, in fact, occur in that hotspot. So, it is on the one hand, yes, the southern focus is important for NATO, always has been important, has been a very important part of its own understanding of its neighboring security environment. All eyes are, of course, now on Ukraine, but in the background, these capacity building initiatives that are quite important also for keeping up dialogues continues. And it's also politically important, right? Because as we just discussed with Mali and the Sahel, the geopolitical dimension with Russia as an adversary continues beyond the geographical focus on Ukraine. And that's, by the way, if you allow me that as a general point, that's also what I often very much miss amongst my colleagues in the security field when we talk about Ukraine, as if Ukraine is an isolated case of the Russia threat. The Russian threat is really worldwide in all kinds of fabrics and elements of where Western interests are affected. So that's, I think, why NATO understands that, why the relationship and partnerships with other regions, particularly also the southern flank, is important.
Okay, thank you. This was very, very insightful. Now, for the last question, I would really like to understand, and I know this is a bit of a speculative question, which do you think will be the most prominent and not necessarily effective types and methods of security interventions, foreign security interventions? Also considering, as you mentioned, the Russian threat, so with Wagner, for example, or with other methodologies.
Yeah, I mean, depends on what do you mean by intervention. So, I mean, are we talking about multinational peacekeeping? Are we talking about capacity building? Are we talking about attacks? We see now terrorist attacks in Israel. Are we talking about proxy wars? So it depends a little bit on what you mean by intervention. So I think, what we're seeing certainly now in the last decade or so, and now it becomes really clear, is the return, even though there's never been really an absence, but a focus now again on interstate war. So that certainly is back. We see a variety of almost domino-like military coups in Africa playing out. We have in the background the geopolitical rivalry between the US and China. So there's a lot of, quasi-aggressive puzzle pieces where major armies are essentially eyeing each other up very carefully in terms of who's making the next move. There's not a direct confrontation, military confrontation, for example, between China and the US, but there is a lot of close military tensions going on. So, depending on what we're talking about now, I mean, where do we see major clashes of troops? Again, that will very much now be in crisis hotspots such as Ukraine, but think about Azerbaijan, Armenia. Think now about Hamas and Israel, and also that will probably widen to Lebanon, where different pieces are. This is pitching Iran versus the US as well again. So in all of that, amidst all of that, you also see a retreat of international, multidimensional peacekeeping or crisis intervention coalitions, right? So the UN is kind of on the back foot. It's not just MINUSMA in Mali, it's also in the Central African Republic, in Congo, they're winding down. So some people even say the era of big footprint UN peacekeeping operations is coming to an end. Not sure about that. I mean, peacekeeping has faced in its 75 years very often moments where people said, no, this is the end of peacekeeping, and it always then, bounced back because it's the only tool that we have, however imperfect it is for conflict containment. The EU is a little bit on the back foot. It no longer has, big military operations apart from in the Balkans. We see, of course, the Balkans as another hotspot. So where you have, again, Kosovo, Serbia, and NATO is still present with KFOR. And then, as you cite yourself in the question, you have a lot of mercenary and quasi, arm's length military groupings that work in the interest of certain states and are, militarily active. So it's a very messy picture. And if you talk about mercenaries, I mean, let's also not forget that a lot of foreign fighters have also decided to fight alongside Ukraine. Some of them with good intentions, some of them with bad intentions. So we also have to see in the future how that plays out. I mean, when they come back from, those foreign fighters come back from their fighting experience, I mean, what do they do with that kind of knowledge, for which kind of cause, and what kind of security implications that has? So, yeah, it's a messy answer for a messy situation, I guess. You see a fragmentation of actors that really have potential security implications for undermining a variety of security stability in a variety of regions, and it is unclear whether you still have enough states willing to muster the will and the resources to organize large-scale crisis intervention or peacekeeping operations, even though this is probably needed more than ever in the months and years to come. If we think about, I mean, on the agenda of the UN Security Council, it feels like there was a constant fire breaking out while you're busy with putting out the one crisis in fire. The next one is emerging, and of course, as we also know, the Security Council itself is facing probably the biggest crisis since its foundation in 1945 when it comes to the rivalries and frictions between permanent members of the Security Council. So yeah, tricky one, and a difficult one. I don't want to be in the shoes of most ministers of defense and peacekeeping planners. It's a very, very messy and difficult picture at the moment.
Okay, yeah, definitely. I guess we could talk for days about this kind of topic and delve into every little detail. But I hope that with this interview, we could at least, give a bit of a bird's eye view of the topic and of the main issues. Well, I want to thank you again for your time. I'm sure you're very busy. And well, now I will stop the recording. And again, thank you for being here and taking the time for these answers.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you very much.